So this talk's going to be a little bit different than the other ones. I'm actually really going to talk about my journey, my career journey through research, and that's really been focused on exploring space here on Earth. So let's go. I'm always curious about who's in the audience, so I generally ask, who's ever said they wanted to be an astronaut? Okay. You know, even as a kid, even now, you know, that's okay. So I was one of those Star Trek geeks, science fiction nerd for sure, but I can honestly say I never said I wanted to be an astronaut. It never occurred to me that that was a profession that you could do. So I didn't have that in mind, and I think going through my navigating path, I wasn't that kid who had a clear goal in mind, even at a high school. People are like, I want to do this. I'm going to go be a doctor. I'm going to be an astronaut. And I was like, I don't know. I guess I'll do science. That'll keep doors open. And I really think this foundation of like setting out to explore without a destination in mind was grounded from my childhood experience of traveling with my family. There were 6 of us. We'd pile in a station wagon and just kind of explore Atlantic Canada. I'm from Halifax originally. So fast forward a little bit, I chose a career in geology. As you can imagine, I like the idea of exploring and going to remote places. And that led me to this opportunity to do a master's project in Southwest Greenland. And I literally chose it because I got to go to Greenland. Okay. I'd like to say it was something wild. Like, the project itself was fascinating. It was study 3 billion-year-old rocks and basically telling their story. How did they form 3 billion years ago? I used to affectionately refer to my research as geofantasy. You know, I'm creating a story based on evidence, of course, but of how these rocks formed. So this was my research project, did it at Memorial. Fascinating stuff. And I have to admit, by the end of this project, I would kind of joke with my supervisor about, you know, them and the 5 people who would read this thesis. You know, it was an academic project. It didn't really have any applied direct links to industry. And I'd be like, oh, you know, the big doorstop, because it was big. It was big. And I realized, thinking back, that was really a reflection of my fear at the time. I think towards the end of my master's, I had lost that connection to how relevant that research was. What was the impact? I'd kind of lost seeing the value in doing basic research. And I really struggled with that. That was a challenge. And so after my master's, it was, what do I do next? You know, and I went off for a year. I worked overseas through Department of Foreign Affairs, I think at the time. And then randomly found an announcement for this place, which is a real place, called the International Space University. It's in Strasbourg, France. And they do a 1-year professional master's program. I'm like, great, this sounds incredible. I like Star Trek. I'm going to go do this. And it was very comprehensive, you know, science, engineering, tourism, marketing, like kind of this learn about the whole sector, all in one go. And it was in, I think, the first week, actually, at ISU, that I was listening to a lecture by a panel, actually, of astronauts. And Dr. Jackie Mukai, who's a Japanese astronaut, was describing her experience of working on space station and her role. And she was actually talking about group dynamics and having this pivotal role as what she described as a boundary person, of having this positive influence. And she actually did research in gender studies. And I was so fascinated by her talk, and I felt the hair go up on my neck. And that was it. I knew. I was like, okay, I'm in. I want to do space research. I want to help do planetary missions. And honestly, for the first time, I set a destination. That wasn't this is after already doing a master's. And I said, okay, I want to work at the Canadian Space Agency, because I was ready to go back to Canada, and I want to work on planetary missions. Okay, let's do it. So while I was at the CSA doing my internship as part of this program, I found out, or I was advised, that I would have to do a PhD. Oh, if you want to be a program scientist in the government, you're going to have to get a PhD. And I was like, okay, fine. I'll go get a PhD. But the good news is, at that time, and this was, I don't know, maybe close to 10 years ago, there's this new kind of field of research around doing comparative planetology. So comparing rocks on Earth to other planets. So places on Earth that were like Mars, that were like the moon. And I was very excited by this research. And so I did research on an impact crater in northern Labrador. And the rocks there are actually very good analogs. They're very similar to the moon. So in a way, we could be studying the moon by studying Earth. So that was exciting, but I had learned from my master's that doing academic geology was not enough. And so I actually tagged on kind of an applied part of my project. And at this time, that was a real challenge. This was a new center at Western, so the Center for Planetary Science and Exploration. I think like a lot of new interdisciplinary centers, when they start, everyone's still in their own buckets. So maybe you do a little bit of this one, a little bit of this one, you piece it together, and it's an interdisciplinary project. And I struggled with that because I really wanted to be studying how we explore the moon. I'm going to skip through. These are rocks just showing like, hey, look, they do look alike. But I was really a bit curious with what are the exploration strategies of studying the moon? What are the group dynamics you need? When we go back to the moon, it's going to look very different than what it looked like in the Apollo days. So that was a weird research topic. And I have to say, in the end, I really did end up doing some hardcore geology papers and then over here some different looking papers around evaluation of this teamwork and the equipment you would use, going back to like LiDARs and 3D vision systems. So this is something we think about and are certainly used when we think about exploration. This is the self-driving car. This is basically an autonomous rover. How are they going to coordinate their efforts with field geologists on the moon? Very different than Apollo. This is coming. This is not far away. So we're practicing this work now on Earth. And so I was really curious around those simulated space missions, basically. So throughout that journey, during my PhD, I'm going to go through this quickly. I'd love to talk about it more later. I fulfilled a lifelong dream. I went to Antarctica. As you can imagine, I was kind of obsessed with going to remote areas and doing field work there. And I got to go, and this was a totally unrelated thing to my research. I don't study meteorites, but I got to go be part of a meteorite hunting team. It's an American research program. And it was there, we lived there. That was my very first meteorite. There, it's right there. So we lived on the ice for like a month and a half, about a couple hundred kilometers away from the South Pole. And again, my fascination with that work, it was great that we're collecting these critical pieces of information for science, but I was really curious about the operations. Because that kind of environment, there are several astronauts who've done this program. They say it's the most similar thing you can get to working on space station. And that's because, of course, the conditions are harsh, it's isolated, it's dangerous, small quarters, those are tense, and limited communications to literally the outside world. And this is the kind of thing we need to think about when we're testing field strategies of the future, where we can go and kind of test what that's going to look like. How are we going to work together? What are our strategies going to be? So I'm just going to wrap it up saying I felt really fortunate. I got to fulfill a lifelong dream. I've done work in the high Arctic. I really wanted that. I had that draw, that pull to Antarctica. I got to do that. But I lost my destination. So I applied to be an astronaut. I wasn't selected. I made it pretty far in the process, but to be fair, it's very unlikely that you're going to be an astronaut, statistically. But during my PhD, my whole goal for starting it was to work at the CSA as a program scientist. That entire department was basically cut during my PhD. Okay, so this happened maybe 8 years ago. I was like, whoa, what's going to happen after that? And I frequently go back to advice I've heard from many people, including astronauts, about doing what you love. And it sounds really trite, and you're like, yeah, whatever. But doing what you love, because you can't control all the conditions that are going to influence where you end up. And so even if you set that goal, there's no guarantee you're going to get there. There's conditions that you can't control for. So that advice means a lot to me. I feel really fortunate that I've basically I've lived the dream of being an astronaut here on Earth, the things I've been able to do in terms of exploration and things like that. I'm going to go back to this to close off, because the work I do now is not directly related to space exploration, but it's certainly linked back to my master's work. So that feeling I had of being disconnected and not valuing kind of basic research, I have a theory. I have a theory that part of that is connected to us not being trained as effective communicators. That's not something that's valued in our research landscape. And I think it's something that certainly helps from a scientific point of view in communicating research, but I actually think it helps us as researchers value our work. If you can communicate it to others, then you see value in what you're doing. And I think if I'd had more opportunities at that stage in my career, I would have felt very differently. So thank you.